At first glance, that great beast appeared to be some sort of rhinoceros with a single horn arcing from its forehead, curved like the crescent moon. But when it opened its mouth and let out a cry, a giant scarlet python uncurled from its blood-red maw. The rhinoceros's bellow, mixed with the python's hissing shriek, made for a particularly stunning impression. In the flesh, a black moon rhinoceros python! Black plus moon plus rhinoceros plus python? Oh, so it really was just a simple combination of these four elements. Quote, Great Master Airplane shooting towards the sky's naming sense was as dependable as always. Zhuo Zilang dutifully moved to stand in front of Tianlangjun, in the process also getting in front of Shen Qingqiu. Furthermore, as soon as Shen Qingqiu saw Luo Binghe, he subconsciously scooted closer to Zhuo Zilang's back. It wasn't like he was desperate to avoid Luo Binghe, but he had a guilty conscience and didn't have the face to look at him. He dared even less to consider what Luo Binghe might be feeling, having seen Shen Qingqiu breathe his last before his eyes a second time. He could only unconsciously avoid the issue by not allowing himself to look, pretending that he couldn't see. He wouldn't be bothered. Tianlangjun raised an eyebrow. This expression, too, bore a remarkable resemblance to something Luo Binghe might wear. So, he didn't hesitate to capture 200 black moon rhinoceros pythons to break the barrier around the holy mausoleum. Pig Lord Chen, this son of mine truly goes to extraordinary lengths for you. Shen Qingqiu had no retort. This was the rare demonic beast that, in the original work, summoned even the endless abyss with its call. Luo Binghe had gone as far as to capture 200 at once in order to break into the holy mausoleum. Only after the dust settled could Shen Qingqiu clearly see that Luo Binghe had indeed broken into the holy mausoleum all by himself. To the demon race, the holy mausoleum was both sacred ground and a restricted area. Either one merited reverence from the local demons, so they wouldn't dare commit any violations. This was a question of faith. So no one had dared come with Luo Binghe. Of course, he could only do it alone. Your courage is commendable, said Tianlangjun. However, while your coming here is of no great consequence, you shouldn't have brought those two strays. Luo Binghe leapt down from the rhinoceros's python's head, a dark expression on his face, as if that great beast had exhausted the last of its energy and could continue no longer. It collapsed to the ground with a crash. Luo Binghe fixed an unwavering glare on Shen Qingqiu, sparks flying from his eyes. He looked furious, yet also as if he was about to cry. Shen Qingqiu suddenly realized that when he ducked behind Zhuo Zilang a moment ago, it had looked too much like he was avoiding Luo Binghe again. But he didn't have the time to explain right now. The person standing beside him was a male lead's dad, the one who even the author had confirmed had a crushing power advantage over the protagonist in all respect. Shen Qingqiu finally got a sound out of his throat. Go back! Luo Binghe didn't respond. With a flick of his hand, he tossed Xiuya's sword over, and only after seeing Shen Qingqiu catch the sword did he turn to face the other two people in the mausoleum hall. After gathering two fiercely roiling masses of demonic energy in his palms, Luo Binghe's figure flickered and he flung them straight forward. Fighting already? Luo Binghe's left hand smashed into Zhuo Zilang's abdomen, sending him flying without a moment of suspense. His right hand bore down on Tianlangjun. Shen Qingqiu went tense, focusing his full attention on the scene. Yet Tianlangjun caught the blow. Without retreating even a single step, he flipped his hand and lightly swept it downward, palm brushing across Luo Binghe's shoulder. Shen Qingqiu swore he could hear the bones breaking within Luo Binghe's body. As if in confirmation, Luo Binghe blinked, then without warning, coughed up a mouthful of blood. The entirety of his chin, neck, and chest were stained red, and the blood continued to drip down to the ground. Luo Binghe wiped the corner of his mouth, looking a bit confused. To tell the truth, it had been a long time since he had been injured to the point of spitting blood. Wasn't it laid down in law that the protagonist had OP plot armor? Have we switched to screwing over the protagonist now that we've done screwing with the reader? Tianlangjun had given Luo Binghe only a light tap on the shoulder, but that arm of his came off again. Tianlangjun furrowed his brow, and Zhuo Zilang immediately scooped up the arm and presented it with both hands. Luo Binghe stopped wiping at his blood and reached behind him to grab Xing Mo's sword from its place on his back, a dangerous glint flashing through his eyes. "That sword is a good blade," remarked Tianlangjun. "It's just a pity that, your technique is a hideous mess." "Come with me," Luo Binghe called to Shen Qingqiu. "It's too late," said Zhuo Zilang. 200 rhinoceros pythons were sufficient to open the Holy Mausoleum's barrier for only an instant, just enough to let you in. "Then I'll use the two of you as blood sacrifices to open it again." But who could have expected that before Xing Mo's sword fully left its sheath, it would be thrusted back inside? At some point, Tianlangjun had moved to stand behind Luo Binghe, and he pressed the sword back into its sheath with a single finger, completely preventing Luo Binghe from drawing it. Luo Binghe's reaction was also extraordinarily swift. He turned to respond, but no matter how fast he moved, he only ever managed to draw Xing Mo's sword 3 inches at most before it was shoved back in. After a few of these exchanges, Tianlangjun seemed to lose interest in teasing Luo Binghe, and with a flick of his wrist, he ignored Xing Mo's sword and directly pressed down on Luo Binghe's skull instead. Luo Binghe's eye snapped open. A dense cloud of purple-black qi roiled atop his head. Tianlangjun lifted his hand, took a look at Luo Binghe's snow-pale face, and commented indifferently, "He looks like his mother." "His eyes look like yours," came a chill voice from the side. Tianlangjun slowly turned his head. Cold light glimmered off Shouya's blade as it pressed against Zhuo Zilang's neck. "It would be a bad deal for you to lose such a good subordinate and darling nephew," Shen Qingqiu said with a faint smile. "Shouldn't Tianlangjun take the time to consider that?" "My lord, this subordinate was incautious," Zhuo Zilang said quietly. Even when he was being, quote, incautious, Zhuo Zilang had been rather difficult to get a hold of. It had taken a great deal of effort on Shen Qingqiu's part just to restrain him. Even when he wasn't in snake form, this fellow was just as slippery. "Zhuo Zilang is a bit foolish. He's quite emotionally fragile," Tianlangjun said lightly. "If you treat him like this, you'll break his heart." "My lord, I'm not foolish," Zhuo Zilang weakly protested. "Meanwhile, I'm not emotionally fragile at all, but I am heartbroken that you're treating my disciple like this," Shen Qingqiu said, half serious. "Release my disciple, and I'll release your nephew, all right?" Tianlangjun spread his hands. "I'm afraid I won't have the chance." In truth, Shen Qingqiu's palms were clammy with cold sweat. His voice was the only thing calm and collected about him. "I'm giving you the chance right now." "I meant," Tianlangjun said, "that I'm afraid Zhuo Zilang won't give me the chance." Tianlangjun had barely finished speaking when Zhuge Zilang suddenly threw himself at Shen Qingqiu's sword point. The force he used was extraordinary, like it really was a matter of life and death, and Shen Qingqiu didn't for a moment suspect he was fainting. He startled and subconsciously withdrew his blade. As soon as he did, Zhuge Zilang seized the opportunity to escape and dashed back to Tianlangjun's side. Tianlangjun made a "see" sort of expression and chuckled. I told you. Zhuge Zilang is a bit foolish. If someone tried to hold him hostage against me, he would seek death himself. Peak Lord Shen must not underestimate him. Shen Qingqiu almost coughed up blood. Zhuge Zilang really had no value to speak of as a hostage. Not only was he hard to catch, even after you finally got a hold of him, it didn't feel like a worthwhile venture at all. But since my nephew had to suffer this little grievance, Tianlangjun said, only reasonable to recoup the loss on Peak Lord Shen's disciple. As he spoke, his fingers slightly curled. Luo Binghe let out a stifled groan and blood flowed from the corners of his eyes. But those eyes still turned towards Shen Qingqiu with great difficulty, and he ground out through the blood foaming in his mouth. Go! Anywhere you want. Just don't stay here. Shen Qingqiu snapped his head up and threw Xiuya's sword forward. It streaked towards Tianlangjun like an arc of white lightning, but Tianlangjun only barely tilted his head, and the blade brushed by his cheek before nailing into the mural far behind him with a clang. Your aim isn't very good, said Tianlangjun. It is very good. Shen Qingqiu slowly pulled his arm back, and a faint smile curved the corner of his mouth. I hit bullseye. Tianlangjun paused, then immediately turned around only to see that Xiuya's sword was stabbed into the mural, right inside the smiling woman's eye. The jewel that had been inlaid as her pupil shattered into pieces. It fell from the stone wall in a twinkling shower. The woman was undoubtedly just a face painted on the wall, but the corners of her smiling mouth curved higher and higher, like she herself was growing happier and happier. The change continued until the split of her mouth reached her ears, like she was grinning with a slit-mouthed woman's bloody maw. Suddenly, a burst of piercing laughter erupted in the mausoleum hall, and the sound came from the mural woman's mouth. The Hall of Delight had anti-theft measures. The mural was inlaid all over with precious stones, but if you pried out even a single one, you could only sit and wait to be laughed to death by the Hall of Delight's demoness and a sound wave attack. The effect of this laughter was especially evident on the demons. After all, the primary intruders the defenses were designed to target were roving demonic tomb raiders. Scant few humans were bored or gutsy enough to go tomb raiding in the demon realm. Upon hearing this laughter, your heart and brain would pound without end. There'd be a wave of acute pain, and the world around you would spin about as your vision blurred. Zhuge Zilang couldn't help but cover his ears, and Tianlangjun also spared a hand to press against his temple. Shen Qingqiu had long been prepared for this turn of events, and using this split second of opportunity, he swept across the hall. With a wave of his left hand, Xiuya's sword flew back into its sheath, and with his right hand he grabbed Luo Binghe and ran. As soon as he charged into the next mausoleum hall, the first thing Shen Qingqiu did was drop the gates and drop them tight. The enormous heavy slab of stone thudded to the ground, stirring up a cloud of dust. He could only find the mechanism to close the door, but not the one to open it, although it would be ideal if this door didn't open at all. As soon as he had this thought and was finally able to relax, he turned his head. What he saw made him collapse to his knees on the spot. Zhuge Zilang blinked at Shen Qingqiu, one arm held tightly in his grasp. He'd really done it this time. He'd actually managed to leave the father-son duo, currently engaged in a one-sided domestic violence, within the Hall of Delight. This was too severe of an offense. A criminal case was about to happen in there. Shen Qingqiu whipped his arm away, turned and went to strike at the stone door, but Zhu Zilang stopped him. Immortal Master Shen, don't go back. He has no chance against my lord. Shen Qingqiu was on the verge of collapse. How could he have grabbed the wrong person from such a close distance? The Hall of Delight mural woman's laughing attack must have been too strong, the light from those green candles too dim, and on top of that, all three of the other men were wearing black robes that looked about the same at first glance. Was it because they were relatives that their tastes in color and style were basically identical? Immortal Master Shen didn't swap out the wrong person, said Zhu Zilang. I swapped the arm you grabbed. This was the last straw for Shen Qingqiu, and he slammed a fist into the stone door. I was trying to take Luo Binghe. Immortal Master Shen, didn't he already take you long ago? Zhu Zilang paused and asked in confusion. Shen Qingqiu was speechless. There really was no way to talk to these people. He raised a hand, gesturing for Zhu Zilang to shut up. Then he turned and walked a few steps, but suddenly realized that the floor beneath his feet wasn't entirely smooth. When Zhu Zilang tried to follow him, he hurriedly held out an arm to stop him. Don't move! An enormous woman's face was painted across the entire floor of this grand hall. They were currently standing on her ear. Unlike the woman in the Hall of Delight, this face had none of that flirtatious beauty. Instead, it was fierce and fiendish, its narrow eyes bulging in rage above a wide nose. The effect was unsurpassably hideous, looking just like a female yaksha. Don't step on the face, Shen Qingqiu said with caution. Zhu Zilang was silent. This whole floor was a face. Where would you step if not on the face? The three halls of delight, fury, and sorrow came one after the other. After the first, the Hall of Delight, the Hall of Fury immediately followed. When the original Luo Binghe had looted, the Holy Mausoleum, he had cleared this level by using a special sequence of steps to cross it. Unfortunately, Shen Qingqiu didn't clearly remember where exactly he had stepped. If a single one was wrong, the anti-theft measures in the Hall of Fury activated. You couldn't even fly over the face on your sword, because as long as you passed directly above any spot on the floor, it counted as a step. That said, of course you'd get angry if someone stepped on your face. No wonder this was a Hall of Fury. Shen Qingqiu had the gall to rush in here because he thought he'd grabbed Luo Binghe, who definitely knew the step sequence. But he never could have expected that this snake would be slippery enough to swap himself in within a split second. The ground grew hotter and hotter. The woman's face on the ground had originally been a scarlet hue, but it darkened to crimson as the heat surged. Shen Qingqiu crouched down to test the temperature, but he had to pull his hand back as soon as it touched the ground. It was as hot as if a fire blazed beneath the floor, and even standing on it would roast you like meat on a hot plate. They must have unknowingly stepped on the face a few times already. Shen Qingqiu retreated a few steps, getting as close to the edge of the room as possible. Suddenly, a red liquid burst out from the ground in a fountain, blazing with searing bright golden glow. Zhu Zilang immediately shifted into his original form, a yellow-eyed green snake coiled on the ground, scales aglow. He reared his upper body and let out a hissing cry, reaching the height of 4 men, then wrapped Shen Qingqiu in a mass of coils, enveloping him securely within a layer of scaly armor. In this position, Zhu Zilang's gleaming fangs were right next to Shen Qingqiu's head, and those giant golden eyes were even more unsettling from up close. Tianlangjun was right. Xi Zhilang really was a bit foolish. Had he forgotten that time he'd been drenched in realga fumes to the point of tears? Had he forgotten how Shen Qingqiu pointed a sword at him just minutes ago? With how hard Zhu Zilang was working to protect him even now, Shen Qingqiu was practically too embarrassed to take advantage of him ever again. Suddenly, with an enormous crash, an entire wall of the Hall of Fury collapsed. Tianlangjun rotated his wrist as he made his way down the pile of rubble, through the floating dust, and stepped into the hall. Am I mistaken, or does the Peak Lord Shen seems more familiar with this holy mausoleum than even me? Zhu Zilang transformed back into human form. "My lord, don't come in!" he cried. Before a questioning expression could appear on Tianlangjun's face, he had already taken 6 or 7 steps across the woman's face on the floor. Shen Qingqiu was speechless. Zhu Zilang was speechless too. A pillar of magma thick enough for 4 men to encircle with their arms outstretched exploded upward. Tianlangjun was instantly engulfed in the raging blaze. Shen Qingqiu internally howled with laughter. See what happens when you don't let others finish talking. See what happens when you beat up your darling son. You can act badass, act as hard as you can, but pride goes before the fall. However, very soon he was unable to laugh any further. Luo Binghe staggered as he followed close behind Tianlangjun and also charged in. One of his arms hung slack at his side like he had been completely broken. Blood poured from his head, and one of his eyes couldn't even open anymore. How wretched! Luo Binghe was in an even worse state than when Shen Qingqiu first laid eyes on him upon his arrival in this world, when the original flavor had beaten him. What was up with Luo Binghe's constitution? Why did his elders all like to teach him lessons with violence? This isn't Baijian Peak. Zhu Zilang anxiously circled that pillar of fire, too preoccupied for anything else. Luo Binghe scanned the scene within the hall, then looked down. He jumped from the pile of rubble and took a few rapid steps before arriving at Shen Qingqiu's side in a flash. This was just unscientific. How come a single glance was all he needed to know where to step so as not to trigger the mechanism? As if Luo Binghe knew what he was thinking, he concisely explained himself. Step on the acupoints. As he spoke, he and Shen Qingqiu had already crossed the Hall of Fury and entered the next room. While the stone gate lowered, Shen Qingqiu couldn't help but take a few more glances at Luo Binghe, confirming that this time he didn't have the wrong person. Shen Qingqiu hesitated at the periphery of the mausoleum hall, afraid to make a hasty move. The demoness of the Hall of Sorrow was perched on the zenith of the hall. When he looked up, as expected, a woman's face was drawn there with her brows tightly knit in an expression of graceful woe. Sensing the intruders, the face's eyes opened and its features twisted into an even more miserable expression. A few drops of water seeped from its eyes, and before long, a dense rain drizzled down from the entire ceiling. Shen Qingqiu was just about to speak up and warn Luo Binghe that this was corpse rain, that they ought not let it touch their bodies, when Luo Binghe raised one of his arms to cover Shen Qingqiu and ran straight across. Just like that, Shen Qingqiu was dragged through the level at top speed. The original Luo Binghe had favored exacting technique. What was up with him now? This method was far too simple and crude. The 3 halls of delight, fury, and sorrow were a subplot that had stretched on for 200,000 words. If one converted the events that had just transpired, it wouldn't amount to a single chapter. The Hall of Sorrow should have been dragged on for at least 10 before and concluded, but now, was that even enough for 3 lines? The system chirped out a notification. Cut down on filler plot. Refined the storyline. B points plus 100. This was too much cutting! After they exited the 3 holy halls, they found themselves in a dark and silent corridor. As soon as they entered it, green flames lit up dimly, row after row, stretching endlessly into the distance. The anti-theft measures of the Holy Mausoleum were practically dense enough to ward off a fly, and to an insane degree. Last breath candle arrays were piled everywhere like they didn't cost a cent, and the blind corpses that had been wandering aimlessly in the earlier corridors now approached, saliva dripping from their mouths. Lobinghe raised his hand, a cold and impatient look on his face. The corpses let out a series of low lamenting hisses, panting breaths rumbling in their throats, before retreating into the shadows with lowered heads. Without sparing Shen Qingqiu a glance, Lobinghe put his hand down and said, "Let's go." Shen Qingqiu noticed that Lobinghe's face was incredibly red. Under the dim green candlelight, the color was exceedingly obvious, but it absolutely didn't seem like a blush of embarrassment. Every time Lobinghe caught Shen Qingqiu before, he had stared at him like he was trying to stare through him, but this time he didn't so much as look. Upon realizing that Shen Qingqiu was looking at him, Lobinghe even avoided his gaze, subconsciously using his unbroken left hand to wipe away the bloodstains by his eyes. Shen Qingqiu wondered if Lobinghe had been poisoned, or if maybe he had suffered a cerebral hemorrhage during the fight. Lobinghe's gait was still steady, so it didn't seem like that was the issue. He was just about to ask when Lobinghe spoke first. "Are the meridians of that body working well?" Shen Qingqiu had never expected this to be Lobinghe's first question. He paused, then replied, "They're working normally." It seemed that every time they fell into a silence, Lobinghe was the first to break it, though when he thought about it, Lobinghe had spent 5 years fixing every one of this body's meridians, bit by bit. Lobinghe nodded. "That's good. I preserved the other body for a few days, but it still withered in the end. It won't bode well if anything goes wrong with this one." Once the soul left a body created by the dew mushroom, it instantly died, then went on to wither and dissolve. For Lobinghe to have actually sustained it for several days, who knew how much spiritual energy he had wasted on the endeavor? And he'd still dared to storm the holy mausoleum by himself right afterward. Shen Qingqiu felt a tightness in his chest, and his thoughts were a scattered and uneasy mess as he tried to find some random topic of conversation. Tianlangjun had mentioned that Lobinghe, quote, brought 2 strays with him, so Shen Qingqiu asked, "Who else did you bring?" Lobinghe finally gave him a glance. "I came alone."